I guess the one positive we have is that it's so fractured that coming in, I didn't come in to try to organize the players. This was player-led, and it was players at the top of the rankings, players at the lower end of the rankings. It was men, it's women. And so they just needed help and needed somebody who could do this full-time because, as you all know, they have really hard, demanding full-time jobs. And so that's I've been lucky enough to almost be invited into that to help, bring some structure to build this out. And we keep talking about building this. We're in our diapers right now as an organization, so we're going to make a lot of messes. You're hitting close to home here, but we're going to make a lot of messes. And but the goal is that 30, 40, 50 years from now, that we're hosting something like this in a building that maybe isn't quite this nice, but as nice as possible to represent the athletes in tennis globally. And so that's exciting. It's a little daunting, but being in rooms like this is just enormously helpful. So thank you to everybody. And
just one more question. So I know you're approached by a large group of players, but the others who might be a little less convinced, how have they been responding to the opportunity or the possibility of joining the PTPA?
Well, that exercise yesterday was a great, it had a ton of utility for me because everything in tennis, from my vantage, needs improvement. To the players who are skeptical, and there certainly are some, because there are some who say, look, especially as an individual sport, you want to make more money, win more, right? And if you win more, lots of other things happen. You don't have to pay for your flights, maybe. You don't have to pay for your own hotel, which, by the way, they do. You still have to pay your coach and your own physio, but those things are easier. So for those players, though, and we have a former world #1 women's tennis player right now who tested positive, allegedly, in September of last year. She's still waiting for an appeal hearing. It's the end of May. And so everybody has at least one thing that they care about. And so finding the one thing for the players who might be not necessarily running with arms wide open to a players association has been really useful, because whether it's gambling policy and how to monetize or drug testing, appeals, fine, process and support. We had a player get fined on Monday more than he made the entirety of 2022. He got fined $130,000. He only made $110 gross before taxes, before any of his own expenses in 2022. And he didn't. You would think he jumped across the net and choked his opponent. He threw a ball on the court to try to trick the umpire, which is bad sportsmanship, admittedly. But does that make any sense? And is anybody there to support him in his appeal? So it's really about finding issues that people care about.
No, for sure. And I think, as has been discussed previously, and I think Omar mentioned it yesterday, to a certain extent, player associations obviously represent the big names, but really the people that you're helping are those guys that make the competition possible, right? You couldn't have the competition without the guys that are making $110,000 in a year.
Yeah, so. And on that point, one of our player leaders is Novak Djokovic, who there was a character yesterday on the thing that was like an outspoken, so it hit close to home. But Novak is well known on the tour for talking to players and saying, hey, are you okay? Do you need any help? Pull out a checkbook and write a check to a player during COVID. And that's great, but Novak, I think he just turned 36, 37. So what, are we just going to hope that somebody else is going to start cutting checks to players, or do we want to build a lasting institution that is actually there to support all the players? Yeah, we get that question a lot from players because they are, like I said, very keenly interested in what we're trying to do and build. That then becomes the question is, well, what leverage do we have? We're never going to go on strike, and we're never going to boycott a Grand Slam. And I always tell them, well, look, that withholding services is always the ultimate leverage that any worker has, right? I just won't show up. But that doesn't mean you have no leverage. It's not 0 or 100. And so let's work through. And so, we had a situation, I don't know if any of you follow tennis, but a few weeks ago in Madrid, where several women throughout the course of a roughly 2-week-long tournament had complained about different things. I mean, things like late matches, which both the men and women have to play, so late into actually early morning hours, down to, in relative importance, the size of a birthday cake. The #2 men's player and the #2 women's player have exactly the same birthday. They both happened over the course of this tournament. The man got a 3 triple-decker cake on center court, no exaggeration. The women got a small cake in a hallway, and they put pictures of this on social media, and so people did what they do, and they cut them and put them side by side and said, "The hell is this?" And then so a bunch of players spoke out and said, "Yeah, this properly reflects the treatment, the disparity in the treatment between men and women on the tours at this tournament in particular, and so on." And so you fast forward to the end of the tournament. If any of you have watched a tennis final, if you win, you usually get to address the crowd. Well, when the women's doubles team won, the microphones were nowhere to be found. And very purposefully, the tournament just lost the microphones before the women's final, and they didn't get to speak. I mean, that was that. And for 4 days after, not either of the tours, none of the other Grand Slams, none of the other tournament owners said a word. The players said a lot, and we said a lot. And so one of the things that I've always said about the leverage, public humiliation is an underrated leverage. Especially tennis is a pretty prim and proper, genteel sport. They are not at all used to that. In football, baseball, industrial context, people are used to that. They're not, and so the tournament put out an apology, and we're not stopping at that. We're going to say, okay, well, how do you prevent this from next year, and how do you put standards in place, and all the things, checks and balances that we talk about in every context, not just that specific context. So I think public humiliation is a very underrated piece of leverage. I think somebody yesterday talked about, was it yesterday, that we 48, not playing for 48 seconds, right? Two shot clocks. So that wasn't boycotting a whole event or a whole game. That was very purposefully making what ended up being an equal. So both teams had a shot clock violation, and then you keep playing, but it makes everybody watching say, "Wait a minute, what was that all about?" And it gives you an entry point to enter into the discussion. And then the last piece related to public humiliation: fans and consumers are an underrated source of leverage. The amazing presentation we got about women's futsal, right? I mean, that whole thing was centered on that because, as opposed to trying to withhold services, they were trying to effectively provide services in another context of a Women's World Cup in futsal. And so how do you get them to do what sounds like they should have done years ago and create that event? There's a public, outcry and a public campaign around it. And so I think those are, underrated pieces of leverage for us. There's many others. The legal framework, we're in a global sport. And so the way it's set up absolutely violates antitrust law in the EU and the US, no doubt about it. It's, what did Tony call it? Collusive behavior, if not outright collusion. And so there's legal levers, there's public levers. There are things around matches and games that players can do short of not showing up entirely. And so those are kind of the three main ones that we've talked about. And that tournament, by the way, has equal pay. So there is this laziness too that people think once you get equal pay, you're done. What more could you possibly ask for female athletes? And that is a starting point, definitely not an ending point. I thought that tournament really in various ways highlighted, no, you can still have them be treated as second-class athletes, even though somebody humiliated you earlier into providing equal pay, because we all know they didn't do that out of the kindness of their own hearts.